All right. So back in the 90s, when I was a kid, I'd go on eBay all the time. It was my first exposure to this global commerce system. I would go on there every weekend, buy baseball cards. Mark, I know you felt a similar way about eBay.
Yeah, I would log on and just see everything I could ever want and nothing that I could afford because I was 12.
Yeah, well, for us 90s kids, that was the reality. In recent times, though, eBay has done a little reconfiguring as a business. And today we're going to be talking about eBay's big comeback in e-commerce and also the hard times it's fallen on as of late. I'm Zachary Crockett here with Mark Dent, and you are listening to the Hustle Daily Show. What's up, everyone? I'm Zachary Crockett here with Mark Dent, and you are listening to the Hustle Daily Show. Today, we're talking about eBay. The website's been around for nearly 30 years. It was the darling of the 1990s internet, and in the past few years, it's really made a push to be relevant again. For a while, that renaissance was working, but now the company has hit some choppy waters. Mark's going to fill us in on what's going on. All right, Mark, we're talking eBay today. eBay was my favorite website when I was 12. I would go on there like every weekend to lust over baseball cards. And I think it was my first exposure to a national online marketplace.
Yeah.
This company was really the pinnacle of the 90s internet boom, right?
Yeah, it was my first online purchase as well, I believe, although CD Now at roughly the same time might have actually been the first. But yeah, basketball card back in like the year 2000 for me. And yeah, it was like Amazon was selling books at the time. CD Now, before Amazon bought it, was selling CDs. Mm-hmm. And eBay had everything. So they were in some ways ahead of the curve. And the interesting thing is that was 20 plus years ago, and eBay is hardly at the front of most people's minds, and yet it's surprisingly powerful and vastly bigger than it was back in what many would consider its heyday.
Yeah, I mean, you could still go on there today, and it's really kind of a niche paradise for collectors. You can search for like a troll doll from the 1970s, and you'll just find like thousands of dolls for sale in this very niche category across many, many different categories.
Right. And as of a couple of years ago, this is a stat from 2020, there was 1.5 billion listings on eBay.
Wow.
And so when we think of like the peak popularity, if you will, of eBay, or at least when it was, in the zeitgeist more, there was only 3.7 million listings. Wow. Okay. So there are 300x as many these days, even though the company is, not doing that great. Although for a while, it seemed like it was having a little bit of a resurrection.
So, let's go back real quick to sort of the early pandemic, pre-pandemic period. As you said, eBay wasn't quite its old self from the 90s. It was kind of struggling a little bit. It was facing some pressure from activist investors, and it was thinking about selling off all their assets. What happened in early 2020 that sort of led to the company turning around?
Well, they did sell off a lot of those assets, including StubHub, the ticket resale website. They sold that for something like $4 billion. And so that kind of made them more of a slimmed down company to where they could focus. And that is like something that Wall Street tends to love. They love focus. And what eBay did was they also hired a new CEO who was a former executive at Walmart, which is obviously one of the biggest competitors of eBay. So that kind of gave them somewhat of a new life. But then they started making some fairly strategic moves that were kind of replicating what their upstart competitors like StockX and The RealReal, which are niche resale websites, had been doing.
StockX, of course, is a sort of a sneaker resale platform, right?
Yeah, they're sneakers. The RealReal is kind of like luxury clothing, name kind of big brand type of clothing. And those websites authenticate everything. So it's not perfect, but when you were buying like a pair of Jordans, you knew that they were going to be legit. And eBay had always had problems with that, going back to the 90s when Beanie Babies accounted for a huge portion of sales on eBay, and a lot of times they weren't legit. So eBay started to authenticate sneakers, watches, handbags, and trading cards, which happened to have, those blew up in popularity during the pandemic. So you saw all these people who were online, and eBay was now a little bit more trustworthy. And these kind of niche communities that you were talking about were all seeing a resurgence at the same time. So it led to a lot more people using eBay. The company saw its active buyers increase from around 174 million in Q1 2020 to 187 million a year later in 2021. Its gross merchandise sales went from around 18 billion to 24 billion. And that number basically encompasses everything that was for sale on the website. And eBay makes its money largely by taking a cut of that. So it was kind of a boom for eBay.
Okay, so the big question at the time was this just a pandemic boom? Because a lot of companies saw a boost in profits, a boost in sales during 2020, 2021. So I think it was sort of a question on people's mind. Is this just an illusion? What have we seen in more recent times as the pandemic is sort of fading back into the background of American discourse?
Yeah, well, we've seen people, log off essentially. And that has been bad for numerous companies, from Zoom to Netflix to Amazon, the biggest competitor of eBay. And so, of course, it's also been bad for eBay. They've seen their user base just shrink at a more rapid rate than it grew. So like I was saying, they had around 187 million active buyers in early 2021. Well, that number started to fall pretty much immediately in the second quarter of 2021, like when people started to get vaccines and venture back out into the world. And now that number was down to 134 million.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, at the end of last year. So that's quite the tumble. Its stock rose up to around 81 in 2021. Now that stock has fallen to 45.
Wow.
They had to lay off 500 people recently. It's just been really bad. And Amazon has had layoffs as well. So it's not unusual for a company in this space, but I think that eBay is suffering worse and has kind of predicted that things are going to be worse for them, in large part just because they're not Amazon, they're not Walmart or Target. They're, those companies are still at the front of people's minds, and eBay just isn't, for whatever reason, even though they still do a lot of sales. It's kind of weird.
Yeah. Any hope here that there will be are they banking on a new generation of consumers? Because obviously the 90s are back in fashion with Gen Z now.
Yeah.
eBay is sort of this 90s relic of tech. And in a weird way, it's sort of come back into the spotlight. I wonder if a part of eBay's new strategy here is to sort of go after this younger demographic.
I think that's part of it, because they have been using, influencers on TikTok, like everybody does, to try and communicate with a younger audience. And I think at least the story that they're trying to show, and, they just released these pretty negative results that we've been discussing just earlier this week. But they've tried to kind of spin it by kind of highlighting that they're like, we are going to be like the big company for sustainability and ESG and all those buzzwords, which do appeal, of course, to a younger audience as well. And that's because eBay, unlike Amazon, unlike Target, unlike Walmart, the primary merchandise that they are selling is resale. And it's something that is essentially a hand-me-down or whatever it might be, whether it's clothing, whether it's a handbag, etc. And so they're touting that as like being, a little bit better for the environment and things of that nature. So they're trying to, say that we are the number one player in the re-commerce space.
Interesting.
And so that might appeal to this younger generation. Sort
of the antidote to the fast fashion, the Sheins of the world that are rising up.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Instead of just the stuff that lasts for 6 months, you're going to buy something that somebody's already worn for 6 years and will hopefully last for another 6 years.
Right. That's an interesting play for sure. The other interesting thing I found about this is just sort of how much they banked on this authentication model for their new business model. It seems like almost an insurmountable challenge. I mean, you see the same thing with like fake reviews on the internet, just sort of lending credibility and authenticity to this vast digital space on the internet that seems impossible to rein in. But I was digging into sneaker culture a little bit this week and just saw a lot of sort of sneakerhead people in the shoe community complaining about eBay's authentication model. And I guess there were these videos that had come out showing employees in the factories sort of validating some of this stuff. And they spend like literally like 20 seconds looking at the box or the shoe and making a decision if it's legitimate or not. And they sort of have to, right? Because the sheer volume of stuff that's passing through their hands, they can't put it under a magnifying glass each time and give it 30 minutes of examination on each item. But I do wonder how stringent those authentication processes are. and what it's really doing to minimize fears about buying fake goods online.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you said, it can just be this impossible task just because of, as I said earlier, there are 1.5 billion listings or whatever on the website. And granted, not all of those are authenticated because they're not expensive enough that they'd have to go through that process. But, some of those other, like the Real and StockX, I mean, they have to do those same things. And I know customers have not always been happy there. And so I almost feel like if eBay somehow becomes like really, really good at authentication, it would certainly give it this tremendous advantage. The question is, like, how do you do that? Like, it is just something that seems unscalable.
I mean, even StockX was sued by Nike because Nike went on the platform and found a bunch of inauthentic shoes being resold, branded as original Nikes.
I'll say this, the last thing I bought on eBay was a Calvin Klein windbreaker, and that baby's authentic as far as I know.
All right, duly noted. Well, if Mark Dent can find an authentic Calvin Klein windbreaker, there's got to be some more of them out there. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us today. Thanks for tuning into the Hustle Daily Show. We're a proud part of the HubSpot podcast network. Our editor today is Robert Hartwig, and our executive producer is Darren Clark. If you want to find more tech and business coverage, go check out our newsletter at thehustle.co/email, and we will catch you next week.